The battlefield was nothing but chaos, fire, and death. Dr. Elias Voss moved swiftly between the wounded, his medical kit strapped to his back, his hands covered in blood, some human, some alien. Explosions shook the ground beneath him as plasma bolts streaked through the air. The Zyrek Dominion, an empire of war-hardened conquerors, was wiping out the last human resistance on planet Varkos. Their warriors, clad in advanced exo-armor, crushed everything in their path, leaving nothing but destruction. Elias was not a soldier, but he had chosen to stay. He wasn't here to fight. He was here to save lives. The human forces were losing. Their outpost was already half destroyed, and evacuation was no longer an option. Elias's team of medics worked frantically to stabilize the wounded, knowing that help wasn't coming. But then, amidst the chaos, something unexpected happened. A massive Zyrek Royal dropship came crashing down from the sky, its engines ablaze, spiraling toward the battlefield like a dying beast. Soldiers, both human and Zyrek, paused for a moment, watching as the ship slammed into the ground with a deafening explosion. Smoke and fire engulfed the wreckage, and then silence. Elias didn't hesitate. He grabbed his gear and ran toward the burning remains, ignoring the shouts of his fellow humans telling him to fall back. If there were survivors in that crash, they needed help. As he reached the wreckage, he spotted movement inside, a figure trapped under debris, struggling weakly. When he got closer, his breath caught in his throat. It wasn't just any Zyrek warrior. It was Princess Soraya, the only daughter of King Valkyr himself. Her armor was cracked, her face bruised, but her fierce golden eyes still burned with hatred as she saw him. "You dare touch me," she hissed, her voice weak but laced with venom. Elias ignored her protests. "You're going to die if I don't help you," he said simply, kneeling beside her, his hands already working to free her leg trapped under a heavy metal beam. The Zyrek Empire was ruthless, but even they had rules. Killing a royal was a death sentence. He knew that if the Zyrek forces found their princess in human hands, they would burn the entire outpost to the ground. Still, leaving her here wasn't an option. He lifted her onto his shoulders, ignoring her struggles, and ran back toward his base. Plasma fire erupted behind him as Zyrek warriors, realizing what was happening, opened fire. He barely made it past the defensive perimeter before human gunners covered him. The moment they were inside the makeshift med bay, he laid Soraya down on a stretcher, his team already preparing medical equipment. "You should have let me die," she spat, wincing as Elias injected a stabilizer into her bloodstream. "That's not how I work," Elias replied, checking her vitals. Her condition was critical, but she would live. The human soldiers were tense. "Doc, what the hell are you thinking?" One of them asked. "You just brought the Zyrek King's daughter into our base. They're going to slaughter us all." Elias wiped sweat from his brow. He knew they were right. He had just painted a giant target on their backs. And then, as if to confirm their fears, the base's warning alarms blared. The Zyrek forces were preparing for an orbital bombardment. The humans had mere hours before the entire base was turned to dust. And Soraya, she was now a liability. Would she betray them? Would she call for her father's forces to attack? Or, against all odds, could she become the key to their survival? Elias had just made the most dangerous decision of his life, and he wasn't sure if it would save them or doom them all. The tension inside the human outpost was thick enough to cut with a knife. Every soldier, every medic, every wounded survivor stared at the unconscious form of Princess Soraya lying on the medical table. Some faces were filled with fear, others with rage. The Zyrek Dominion had burned their cities, slaughtered their families, and now their leader's daughter was in their midst, under the care of a human doctor. Elias ignored the murmurs around him as he finished stabilizing Soraya's wounds. The advanced medical equipment beeped softly, confirming she was no longer in critical condition. But the real danger wasn't her injuries. It was what would happen when she woke up. A grizzled soldier named Jackson slammed his fist against the nearest wall, his face red with anger. "You've doomed us all, Doc," he growled. "The Xerac are gonna bomb this place to hell because of her." Elias looked up, his jaw tight. "And leaving her to die would have changed that. They were going to wipe us out anyway." "That's the difference, Voss," Jackson shot back. "Now they have a reason to do it faster." Before Elias could reply, a sharp gasp filled the room. The soldiers stiffened, their hands instinctively reaching for their weapons. Suraya's golden eyes fluttered open, filled with confusion at first, then rage. Her hand moved to her hip, searching for her blade, but she found nothing. She sat up too quickly, groaning as pain shot through her body. Then she looked around, realizing where she was. A human base. She spat the words like venom. Her gaze locked onto Elias. "You dare to capture me? You're not a prisoner," Elias said firmly. "I saved your life." Suraya's expression twisted into a mix of hatred and disbelief. A human saving the Xerac Royal. She scoffed, but her voice was weaker than she intended. "Your kind destroys. You don't save." Elias didn't rise to her provocation. "Believe whatever you want, but you were dying, and now you're not. That's all that matters." She narrowed her eyes. "Do you think this kindness will spare you? My father will come. He will burn this place to the ground." The tension in the room grew worse. Jackson clenched his fists. "Then why are we keeping her alive? If she's just gonna call for her daddy to kill us, we should put a bullet in her head now." Elias stepped between Jackson and Suraya, his voice cold. "That's not happening." "Like hell, it's not," Jackson barked. "She's a Xerac, Doc. One of them. They're not like us. They don't have mercy. They don't have honor. They take and they destroy." Suraya's lips curled into a smirk, despite her pain. "At least one of you understands the truth." Elias turned to her, frustrated. "You're not helping." Suraya didn't care. She knew how humans saw her people. Ruthless, cold-blooded, conquerors. And in truth, she believed it too. She had been raised to think of humans as weak, as creatures who deserved to be crushed beneath the Xerac Empire's rule. Yet now one had saved her life, had stitched her wounds, had defended her even against his own people. Why? Jackson wasn't done. "Give me one reason, Doc. One reason why we shouldn't kill her before she kills us." Elias exhaled. He had expected this reaction, but it still exhausted him. "Because we're not them," he said quietly. "If we become like them, then we've already lost." The words settled in the air, heavy and unshakable. Jackson muttered a curse under his breath and stormed out, but Elias knew this wasn't over. The others in the room still watched, uncertain. He had just saved their worst enemy, and now they were all stuck waiting for the consequences. Syria leaned back against the medical table, studying Elias. "You are a fool," she said eventually. "A dead fool." Elias didn't look away. "Maybe. But right now, you're alive because of it." For the first time in her life, Princess Suraya felt something strange, a flicker of doubt, an unfamiliar discomfort in the way she had always seen the world. It made her want to fight harder, to resist. But deep down, something in her knew. This human had changed everything. The cold night air wrapped around the outpost like a silent predator, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The tension had not faded. It clung to the air, thick and suffocating. The soldiers barely spoke to Elias now. Some still trusted him, but most saw him as a man who had made a foolish mistake, one that could cost them all their lives. Syria sat on the edge of the medical bed, her golden eyes scanning the dimly lit room. Her wounds had mostly healed, thanks to Elias's skill and the advanced human medical technology. But despite her recovery, her position remained unchanged. She was an enemy in the heart of a human outpost. The hatred in their eyes, the stiff postures whenever she moved, it was all painfully obvious. She should have felt disgusted, humiliated by this weakness. Yet every time she looked at Elias, that certainty wavered. Why? Why had he saved her? What did he expect in return? Elias sat across from her, silently checking supplies, lost in thought. She hated the way he ignored her, as if she was just another patient instead of the daughter of a king, a warrior of the Zirek Dominion. "You should have let me die," she finally said, breaking the silence. Elias didn't even look up. "I think we've been over this already. You risked your life for me," she continued, frowning. "Your people hate me. Even now, they want me dead. Was it worth it?" Elias sighed, finally meeting her gaze. "I don't expect you to understand." Syria narrowed her eyes. "Then explain it to me, human." Elias put down the equipment in his hands. He leaned back, folding his arms. "It's simple. I'm a doctor. I save lives. It doesn't matter whose." Syria scoffed. "That's a weak answer." Elias smirked slightly. "Maybe. But it's the truth." She stared at him for a long moment, studying every detail of his expression. He wasn't lying. That frustrated her even more. The Zirek Dominion believed in strength above all else. They conquered, they dominated, and they destroyed anything weaker than themselves. Kindness was a foreign concept. "You humans are strange," she muttered, looking away. Elias chuckled. "You say that like it's a bad thing." Syria didn't answer. She wasn't sure how to respond. A sudden commotion outside broke the uneasy silence. Elias stood up immediately, grabbing his rifle out of instinct. Syria followed him with her gaze, confused by his reaction. Moments later, the door burst open, and Jackson stormed in. His face was tense, his eyes burning with urgency. "We've got a problem," Jackson said, his voice sharp. "Zirek scouts spotted near the perimeter. They're looking for her." He pointed at Syria. Syria felt her heart quicken. Her father's forces were close. That should have meant safety, freedom. But a small, unexpected feeling of unease settled in her chest. Elias exhaled, rubbing his forehead. "How much time do we have?" "Not enough," Jackson said grimly. "They'll figure out she's here soon. And when they do, they'll rain hell down on us." Syria stood up. "Then release me," she said simply. "If they see me alive and unharmed, they will spare you." Jackson barked a laugh. "You actually believe that? The moment they see you in a human base, they'll assume we tortured you or used you as leverage. Your father won't hesitate to wipe us out, no matter what." Syria frowned. She wanted to argue, but deep down, she knew Jackson wasn't wrong. Her father would never allow the possibility of his daughter being compromised by humans. He would see it as a stain on their honor, a stain that could only be cleansed with fire and blood. Elias looked at her. "Then we need another plan." Jackson shook his head. "No, we don't need a plan, Doc. We need to hand her over." Elias's expression hardened. "Not happening." Jackson stepped forward, his anger flaring. "She's not one of us. You think saving her life changed anything? She's Zirek royalty. The moment she's back with them, she'll tell them everything she knows. She'll lead them right back to us." Syria clenched her fists. "You think I would betray my own honor like that?" Jackson scoffed. "Honor? Don't make me laugh." Elias stepped between them. "Enough." He turned to Syria. "You don't have to betray your people, but if we don't figure something out fast, none of us are going to live long enough for it to matter." Syria met his gaze. There was something in his eyes. Determination, defiance. He wasn't afraid of her. He wasn't afraid of the Zirek Dominion. He was willing to stand against an empire just to keep her alive. For the first time in her life, Syria felt something strange. Loyalty. Not to her father, not to the Zirek Dominion, but to him. The great hall of the Zirek Dominion's capital was silent, yet the tension in the air was thick enough to crush bones. Massive stone pillars lined the room, carved with the history of the Zirek's greatest conquests. Torches burned with a deep blue flame, casting long shadows across the dark metallic floors. At the center of the room sat the Zurek king, Vorkon, his golden armor gleaming under the firelight. His piercing eyes locked onto the two figures before him, his daughter, Surya, and the human who had saved her life. Elias stood firm, despite the overwhelming presence of the Zurek warriors surrounding him. Their weapons were drawn, their claws twitching with barely restrained aggression. He knew he could be killed in an instant. Yet, he did not falter. He had come here for a reason. Surya knelt before her father, her head bowed. But unlike a prisoner, she did not tremble. She did not beg for mercy. She had spent her entire life proving her strength to her father, and she would not stop now. You dare return to me in the presence of a human? King Vorkon's voice was deep, filled with controlled fury. You, my own blood, standing beside the enemy. Surya lifted her chin, her golden eyes fierce. I am not standing beside the enemy, father. I am standing beside the one who saved my life. A murmur spread through the gathered warlords and advisors. The idea of a human saving the Zurek, let alone the king's own daughter, was an insult to their very nature. They were conquerors. They were warriors. They did not require saving. Elias took a slow breath. He knew this was a dangerous moment, but he also knew he couldn't stay silent. Your Majesty, Elias spoke, his voice calm but firm. I did not save Surya to gain favor. I did it because she was wounded, and I am a doctor. Her life mattered, just as any life does. The king's gaze snapped to him, sharp and deadly. You speak of life as if it has equal value. Tell me, human, do you think you are equal to us? Elias met his gaze without fear. No, you are stronger, faster, more advanced, but none of that changes the fact that saving her was the right thing to do. The room fell into silence. It was not the answer they had expected. King Vorkon leaned forward slightly, studying Elias like a predator deciding whether to strike. And what do you expect in return for this so-called kindness? Elias shook his head. Nothing. A deep growl rumbled through the hall. Many of the Zurek warriors were growing restless. The idea that a human could stand before their king without fear was an offense in itself. Surya clenched her fists. Father, he speaks the truth. He did not demand ransom. He did not use me as a hostage. He protected me even when his own people distrusted him for it. He had every reason to let me die, yet he chose to save me instead. King Vorkon exhaled slowly, his expression unreadable. He turned his gaze back to Elias. You risked your life for my daughter, and yet you knew she would eventually return to her people who have no mercy for yours. Elias nodded. I knew. Vorkon was silent for a long moment. Then he stood, his towering form casting a long shadow over them. His voice was quieter this time, but no less dangerous. You have done something that no other human has ever done before. You have shown honor where there should have been none. You have saved my blood when others would have let her perish. His gaze darkened. And that leaves me with a difficult decision. Surya felt her heart pound. She knew what was coming. The king turned to the warlords. By our laws, any outsider who interferes with royal blood should be executed. Yet to kill a man for showing strength and mercy. He paused. Would that not make us weak? The warlords exchanged uneasy glances. The Zurek were ruthless, but they were also bound by their own codes. Killing a man who had saved a life, even an enemy, could be seen as cowardly. The king turned back to Elias. You are bold, human. Perhaps too bold for your own good. But you have earned something no human has ever earned before. My respect. A collective gasp echoed through the hall. Elias remained still, his face unreadable. King Vorkon exhaled, his expression thoughtful. Surya, you have a choice. If you wish to return to your people, I will not stop you. But if you believe this human's actions deserve recognition, then speak now. Surya's breath caught in her throat. She had spent her entire life proving herself as a warrior, as her father's daughter. But in the past days, she had learned something far greater than just strength. She had seen loyalty, courage, and honor in a form she had never expected. She turned to Elias. He had risked everything to bring her here. He had stood before her father without fear, without demands. He had treated her as more than just a princess, more than just a soldier. And in that moment, she knew her decision. She looked her father in the eyes. "I choose to stand with him." The silence that followed was deafening. King Vorkon did not move. For a long moment, it seemed as if the entire hall had stopped breathing. Then, slowly, the king nodded. "So be it." The warlords erupted into chaos. Shouts of protest filled the air. But the king raised his hand, silencing them instantly. "She has made her choice," he said firmly, "and by our laws, it will be honored." He looked at Elias once more. "Human, you walk away with your life today, and you leave with something far greater, my daughter's loyalty." Elias swallowed, glancing at Soraya. He had not expected this. But as Soraya stood beside him, unwavering, he realized something. This was no longer just about survival. This was the beginning of something far greater. The air inside the great hall was thick with tension, but Soraya stood firm beside Elias. The murmurs of discontent from the Zirak warlords filled the chamber, their sharp eyes glaring at the human who had defied expectations. No one had imagined this outcome, a human walking free from the Zirak king's court, let alone with the unwavering loyalty of his daughter. It was unthinkable. It was madness. And yet, it had happened. Elias remained still, his mind racing. He had only done what was right, what any decent person would have done. Yet here he was, caught in the middle of something far larger than himself. The king had granted him mercy, but the hostility in the room told him that many still wished to see him dead. He could feel the weight of their hatred pressing against him like an invisible force. King Vorkon turned to his warlords, his voice cutting through the noise. "You speak of pride, of strength, of tradition. And yet, none of you were there when my daughter lay dying. None of you lifted a hand to save her. This human, this so-called weakling, did what even our own kind failed to do. If that is weakness, then tell me, what does that make us?" A heavy silence followed. The warlords looked at one another, their anger unable to find a proper outlet. They could not challenge their king's words. Vorkon had spoken the undeniable truth. Syria stepped forward, her golden eyes fierce. "I will not stand by while blind hatred dictates our future. I have fought for our people. I have bled for our empire. But I will not turn my back on someone who has proven more honorable than half the warriors in this room." She turned to her father. "I have made my choice." Elias could hardly believe what he was hearing. Soraya had been raised in a world where humans were seen as lesser beings, as weak creatures unworthy of respect. Yet she had chosen to stand beside him. The king's expression remained unreadable, but there was something in his gaze that Elias couldn't quite place. Approval? Regret? It was impossible to tell. Then, slowly, Vorkon spoke. "You are my daughter, Soraya. I will not deny you the path you choose." His gaze flickered toward Elias. "But you, human, you must understand what this means. You are no longer an outsider. You are no longer just some doctor who happened to save a life. By standing here, by earning her loyalty, you have placed yourself in the center of a storm." Elias took a slow breath. "I understand." "Do you?" Vorkon's eyes gleamed dangerously. "Because from this moment forward, you are no longer just a human in our empire. You are a name that will be remembered by those who respect you and by those who want you dead." Elias knew he was right. He had not just saved Soraya. He had disrupted the delicate balance between their two species. To some, he had proven humanity's worth. To others, he had committed an unforgivable offense. One of the warlords stepped forward, his voice filled with barely contained fury. "This is a mistake, my king. A human cannot be trusted among us. He will betray us the moment it benefits him." Elias met the warlord's gaze without flinching. "If I wanted to betray you, I would have let Syria die." The warlord's mouth snapped shut, his fury unable to counter the cold logic of those words. King Vorkon let out a low, rumbling chuckle. "You speak boldly, human. Perhaps that is why my daughter sees something in you." His tone grew serious once more. "Leave this hall. Leave this city. There are those who will hunt you now, who will see you as a threat. But if you survive, then perhaps you are worthy of standing beside my blood." Elias nodded. He had been given his answer. He had been given his chance. Syria turned to him, determination in her eyes. "I'm going with you." The king did not object. He simply watched as his daughter took her place at Elias's side. The two of them walked out of the hall together, leaving behind the whispers, the glares, and the uncertain future that lay ahead. But one thing was clear. This was not the end. It was only the beginning.